What we're beginning to sense swirling around Marc Marquez these days isn't just another fleeting piece of gossip that pops up on social media only to fade away within 48 hours. No, this feels far more substantial and potentially disruptive. In the high-stakes world of MotoGP, where whispers can quickly turn into game-changing realities, there's a growing atmosphere in the paddock that carries real weight. It is something infinitely more valuable than any official denial: genuine context. And when that context starts aligning perfectly with the speculation, when scattered clues begin falling into place on their own, and when a legendary manufacturer like Honda suddenly shows unmistakable signs of revival right on the eve of the massive technical overhaul scheduled for 2027, then we're no longer dealing with mere smoke and mirrors. Instead, we're confronting a genuine possibility that, even if it remains unofficial for now, is starting to send genuine ripples of concern through certain camps. Ducati, in particular, understands this dynamic all too well. If Honda manages to claw its way back toward genuine competitiveness, and if Marquez begins to feel that the balance of power in the sport could be shifting dramatically, then the once unthinkable bombshell scenario for 2027 stops looking like wild fantasy and starts resembling a very real, looming threat. At the heart of this entire discussion lies a crucial nuance that many observers tend to overlook or simplify. Plenty of people latch onto the straightforward statement Marquez made earlier, where he openly declared that staying with Ducati represented his primary preference. And yes, he did say that, but he followed it up with an equally important clarification. He had asked Ducati to exercise patience, to avoid rushing into anything premature. He needed more time, more information, and more visible developments before committing fully. That subtle but profound difference changes the entire equation. There's a world of separation between confidently announcing, "I want to stay," and deliberately requesting, "Please wait." In MotoGP, when a rider of Marquez's caliber, a multiple-time world champion with unmatched talent and experience, asks for breathing room on such a critical decision, it's rarely without deeper strategic thinking. He's not hesitating out of indecision or caprice. He's looking further down the road, anticipating how the landscape will transform with the arrival of the new regulations in 2027. He recognizes that major technical resets like this one have the power to upend established hierarchies almost overnight, reshuffling the competitive order in unpredictable ways. Above all, he knows that if there's any factory capable of tempting him with the promise of one final, epic historical chapter in his career, it has always been and likely always will be Honda. Let's be honest, the bond between Marquez and Honda wasn't some ordinary professional partnership. It was a legendary era-defining alliance. It represented absolute dominance, jaw-dropping performances, and almost symbiotic identification between rider and machine, and a shared history filled with unforgettable triumphs, multiple world titles, spectacular displays of skill, and yes, heartbreaking physical tolls and devastating injuries that nearly derailed everything. Because of that intense, intertwined past, equal parts glory and sacrifice, any hint of Honda showing renewed vitality automatically ignites the imagination of everyone in the paddock. And this season, those hints are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Honda hasn't just posted modestly better lap times during testing. They've demonstrated tangible, meaningful progress with the latest evolution of the RC213V. The atmosphere inside their garage has shifted noticeably toward optimism and confidence. Even MotoGP official channels have highlighted that HRC has taken a significant step forward, with expectations now considerably higher for the Japanese brand to start fighting for podiums and victories again, levels of ambition that seemed almost unrealistic just a short time ago. When a powerhouse like Honda transitions from being viewed as a struggling, sinking project to a serious rebuilding effort with real momentum, the name of Marc Marquez inevitably resurfaces in every serious conversation about the future. That's precisely what makes this emerging scenario so unsettling for some. It's not that an announcement is imminent tomorrow, nor that any contract has been inked behind closed doors. What's more dangerous for Ducati is the way the broader context is quietly cracking open a mental door that many had long assumed was permanently sealed shut. For a long while, the mere thought of Marquez making a sensational return to Honda sounded almost like a bittersweet joke or a cruel reminder of past suffering. The idea of going back to the very place where his career endured so much physical destruction, frustration, and battles against seemingly unrideable motorcycles. But if the 2027 regulations introduce an entirely fresh technical canvas, if Honda continues building on its recent advancements throughout 2026, If the Japanese manufacturer arrives at the new era with a solid, competitive foundation, and if Ducati begins to lose its aura of unquestionable dominance, then the narrative flips completely on its head. Suddenly, it wouldn't feel like a painful return to old ghosts. It would feel like the chance to spearhead an inspiring new renaissance, to lead a historic comeback story from the front. For a fiercely competitive mind like Marquez's, that kind of opportunity, combining legacy, emotion, and the potential for one last monumental achievement, could prove irresistibly attractive. And Ducati has every reason not to rest entirely easy right now, despite their undeniable strength. Yes, the Borgo Panigale factory remains a powerhouse with formidable resources and engineering prowess. However, the 2026 championship no longer carries that overwhelming sense of total, crushing superiority that once felt almost permanent. Aprilia, for instance, has exploded onto the scene this year with ferocious pace and results. Riders like Bezzecchi have already tasted victory, and the Knoll team has racked up impressive early-season statistics that are turning heads. Voices across the paddock are openly discussing whether this represents one of Ducati's most vulnerable periods in quite some time. In short, Ducati no longer projects absolute invincibility, and whenever a dominant force starts showing even small cracks, its star riders naturally begin scanning the horizon. They start asking tougher questions, weighing not just today's results but which environment will best position them to rule the next major cycle. This is exactly where Honda slips back into the picture with renewed relevance. That's why the conversation isn't solely about Honda's recovery or Marquez's future. It's about a potentially explosive convergence of factors. Honda gaining ground, Ducati revealing subtle weaknesses, Aprilia applying intense pressure, and Marquez strategically keeping his options open precisely as the entire paddock turns its gaze toward 2027 as the year when everything could be rewritten. This mix has the potential to be pure dynamite. What truly worries Ducati isn't some random headline rumor, it's the undeniable logic building behind it. Honda possesses room for further development, a deep emotional and historical connection with Marquez, the romantic appeal of a grand revival story, and the perfect reset button in 2027 that could render many current advantages less relevant. If you were in Ducati's shoes, how could you not view this with a degree of unease? Marquez, meanwhile, sits in an ideal position to apply quiet but effective leverage without uttering a single provocative word. He doesn't need to make bold declarations or drop heavy hints. All he has to do is refrain from slamming the door completely shut. By simply maintaining that he needs more time, as he explicitly requested, he reinforces his bargaining power with every passing week. Each delay in finalizing a rock-solid renewal strengthens his influence, heightens Ducati's incentive to act, and keeps alive the perception that the legendary 93 still holds the cards to select his next defining project. The longer this sense of openness lingers, the more oxygen it gives to the specter of a Honda return. Not because it's the most likely outcome today, but because every incremental improvement in Honda's RC213V performance and every competitive question mark around Ducati adds a little more credibility to the idea. Something else that often gets underestimated in these discussions is where Marquez stands in his career arc. He's no longer in the early or mid-phase where decisions revolve purely around money, stability, or short-term comfort. He's entering that rare stage where every major choice is weighed against something far deeper: legacy. The desire to author one final masterpiece, to choose the stage where he can deliver his ultimate historic statement. Staying with Ducati makes perfect practical sense in many ways. It's currently a top-tier project and he's publicly called it his first choice. But precisely because of that solid foundation, if Honda ever evolves into a remotely believable alternative by 2027, the emotional and narrative pull of that possibility would be enormous. It wouldn't register as just another rider transfer. It would be the perfect, cinematic story to captivate the entire motorsport world. The champion returning home to the brand where he built his empire, not to relive old triumphs, but to rewrite the script with a bold new chapter of resurgence. And here's perhaps the most critical element that could truly elevate this into a full-scale bombshell: the anxiety it creates within Ducati itself. When a top team realizes it risks losing a rider of Marquez's magnitude right at the threshold of the most significant regulatory shakeup in years, their entire approach to negotiations shifts. They accelerate talks, sweeten offers, and move to secure commitments faster. Even if Marquez ultimately stays put, he would have already scored a significant victory in the battle of positioning, pressure, and influence, reminding the whole paddock that his name still carries enough gravity to reshape high-level strategic decisions. Honda doesn't even need the absolute best motorcycle on the grid right now or a ready-to-sign contract on the table. to re-enter the conversation meaningfully. All it takes is steady, visible progress, positive feedback from its current riders, and MotoGP itself beginning to narrate their comeback story. In a sport driven heavily by momentum and perception, that shift in how Honda is viewed, from a broken entity with no clear path forward to a historic brand methodically rebuilding itself in perfect timing for 2027, is powerful enough on its own. Add to that another uncomfortable detail for Ducati. The start of the 2026 season hasn't been entirely smooth sailing for Marquez. There have been inconsistencies, moments of tension, discussions around penalties, and lingering questions about his physical condition following past injuries. Some paddock insiders have even speculated that the long-term effects of those injuries could influence the closing stages of his career. When a rider of his stature reaches a point where every decision carries double the weight, balancing competitive ambition with bodily realities, he naturally scrutinizes projects not just for immediate success, but for the best possible competitive and emotional narrative moving forward. It's no longer solely about who is winning today, it's about where he can still build something truly monumental tomorrow. And if Honda keeps climbing while Ducati shows occasional vulnerabilities, that calculation becomes far more complex than it appeared at the beginning of the year. So yes, Honda is back in the mix, not necessarily because of some aggressive, immediate official pursuit, but because the evolving circumstances are once again giving real substance to an idea that once seemed permanently buried. And in MotoGP, when a concept this charged regains logical footing, it stops being harmless speculation and starts functioning as a genuine threat. A threat to Ducati, which must now work harder to lock down its star and protect its stability. A threat to the broader paddock, which knows that such a move would send shockwaves through the entire ecosystem. And even a threat to rival teams because a highly motivated Marquez, armed with a fresh technical challenge and a deeply personal historic mission, could set the championship ablaze long before the 2027 season even begins. This is why the situation carries such weight. Right now, we may only be seeing disconnected fragments. A cautious comment here, a delay in contract talks there, measurable gains from Honda, a slightly less intimidating Ducati, and an aggressive Aprilia pushing the limits. But when you connect all those pieces, the emerging picture is of a chessboard that is reopening in fascinating ways. On that board, Marquez remains the single most influential piece, the one capable of altering the entire game, of transforming Honda's steady improvements into the blockbuster story of 2027. Ultimately, that's the real source of the unease. Honda may not have played its final card yet, Marquez hasn't made an irreversible choice, and Ducati may still believe it can retain him. But in MotoGP, major earthquakes rarely begin with the dramatic signing of a contract. They often start much earlier, the moment the paddock collectively senses that a long-shot possibility is regaining plausibility. That's precisely what's happening now. The notion of Marquez starring in the great 2027 drama no longer sounds like an impossible fantasy. It's beginning to sound like a scenario that no one can fully rule out. That's why Ducati is glancing sideways with caution. That's why Honda is creeping back into discussions. That's why every gesture, every silence, and every carefully chosen word from Marquez carries extra significance these days. Because as a new cycle approaches, as projects realign, and as a living legend like Marquez keeps certain doors ajar, the entire championship enters a phase of heightened tension where anyone could feel the repercussions. In such fluid environments, the manufacturer that hesitates, the team that grows overconfident, or the squad that misreads the shifting currents risks being left behind when the biggest move of all unfolds. So the real question isn't simply whether Honda harbors dreams of bringing Marquez back into the fold for 2027. The more pressing issue is whether Ducati is doing everything in its power to ensure that dream remains nothing more than a distant fantasy rather than evolving into a concrete, actionable threat. Because if the paddock has taught us anything over the years, it's that the truly seismic transfers don't arrive with blaring alarms. They begin with subtle signals, understated movements, and seemingly innocent comments, until one day the momentum becomes unstoppable. And if this particular story continues to gather strength, if Honda keeps delivering incremental progress, if Ducati fails to project unbreakable confidence, and if Marquez maintains the strong negotiating position that allows him to survey the board with calm authority, then we might be witnessing the early stages of an operation that currently feels distant, but could, in just a few months, explode into the most explosive news in all of MotoGP. A development powerful enough to reorder hierarchies, shatter existing plans, and prove once again that in this unforgiving sport, no one's future is ever truly locked down when a historic opportunity knocks.